She burst into the Count's chambers to escape, unaware he was inside. But when their eyes met, before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining us from. And subscribe if you love romantic stories like this. Now let's fall into this tale together. The rain had been falling over Derbyshire for 3 entire days, each drop striking the windows of Thornhill House with a persistence that felt almost personal, as though the sky itself had decided to weep and would not stop until every last tear had been shed. Isabel Thornwood stood motionless in the dim corridor outside the drawing room, her back pressed against the cool plaster wall, her breath coming shallow and careful. She could hear them inside. The voices carried clearly through the gap beneath the door, sharp and cutting despite the muffling effect of heavy wood and thick carpets. Lady Margaret Thornhill's voice, first, cold and precise, each word enunciated with the kind of clarity that came from years of commanding servants and cowing relatives into submission. The girl is 24 years old. Constance, 24. Do you understand what that means? It means she should have been married and gone from this house 2 years ago at the very least. Instead, she sits in my home, eating my food, wearing dresses I pay to have altered, and contributing absolutely nothing of value to this family. There was a pause. Isabel could picture her aunt standing near the fire, one hand resting on the mantelpiece in that particular way she had when she was working herself into a fury. The image was so clear in Isabel's mind that she might have been standing in the room watching it happen. "But Mama," came Constance's voice, softer, uncertain. Constance was the eldest of Lady Margaret's 3 daughters, 25 years old and growing more desperate with each passing season. "Isabel has received offers. That gentleman last month, Mr. Wickham, he was quite serious in his intentions. Mr. Wickham is 63 years old with 6 children and a fondness for brandy that borders on the scandalous," Lady Margaret snapped. "Even Isabel, with her complete lack of fortune or connections, can surely do better than that. Though I begin to wonder if she understands just how limited her options truly are." Catherine's voice joined in then, 23 years old and sharp with something that sounded uncomfortably close to satisfaction. "Perhaps she believes her face will be enough. She has always been rather vain about her looks." Isabel closed her eyes. Her hands, pressed flat against the wall behind her, had gone cold despite the warmth of the house. She knew she should move, should walk away, should stop listening to words that could only hurt her, but her feet seemed to have taken root in the floorboards. "Her face," Lady Margaret said, and now her voice had taken on that particular tone of poisonous sweetness that Isabel had learned to recognize and dread, "is indeed remarkable. Golden hair, those ridiculous blue eyes, skin like cream. Yes, she is beautiful, devastatingly so, and do you know what that beauty has cost this family?" Silence from the daughters. "It has cost us 3, perhaps 4, perfectly acceptable matches for you girls. Gentlemen who might have looked twice at Constance or Catherine, who might have seen the value in marrying into a respectable family with modest but reliable fortunes, instead spend their evenings staring at Isabel like lovesick puppies. And does she encourage them? Does she make herself agreeable, secure an offer, and remove herself from our burden? No. She sits in corners reading books, or walks alone in the garden, or spends hours in the library as though she were some sort of blue-stocking intellectual rather than a penniless orphan who should be grateful for any scrap of attention she receives. She did refuse Baron Ashworth last spring, Amelia offered. She was the youngest at 20, still hopeful enough to occasionally defend Isabel when the attacks became too vicious. Perhaps she simply did not care for him. Care for him? Lady Margaret's voice rose sharply. Care for him? The man has 3,000 a year and an estate in Lincolnshire. What possible grounds could she have for refusing him? Love, affection. These are luxuries for women with dowries and connections, not for charity cases, who should be thanking God on their knees every night that they have a roof over their heads and food on their plates. Isabel's throat had tightened to the point where breathing felt difficult. She pressed one hand to her chest, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. She had heard variations of this conversation before, of course. Her aunt was not subtle in her disdain. but there was something particularly cruel about hearing it spoken so plainly when she was not present to defend herself, hearing the full measure of her aunt's contempt laid out like evidence in a trial. "The real problem," Lady Margaret continued, her voice dropping slightly as though she were sharing a confidence, "is that she still believes she deserves better than what life has given her. She was the daughter of a viscount, you see. Never mind that her father was a fool who lost everything through poor investments and left her with nothing but a title she cannot use and a face that is more curse than blessing. In her mind, she is still Lady Isabel, still deserving of respect and consideration. She has not yet learned that she is nobody, nothing." The word landed like a blow. Isabel felt it physically, a sharp pain in her chest that made her gasp silently. Nobody, nothing. "Now, Tas," Lady Margaret said, and her tone shifted to something more practical, almost businesslike. "Tonight we have Count Rothwell coming to dine. He has recently returned from the continent, and while there has been some unfortunate talk about the nature of his return, he remains a count with a considerable fortune and an estate that borders our own. He is 31, unmarried, and I have invited him here with the express purpose of introducing him properly to you three girls." "But Mama," Catherine said, sounding intrigued now, "I heard that Count Rothwell's diplomatic mission was a complete disaster. They say he was sent to negotiate a trade agreement and somehow managed to make things worse, that he returned in absolute disgrace." "I care nothing for politics or diplomacy," Lady Margaret said dismissively. "What I care about is that he is single, wealthy, and currently too embarrassed by his professional failures to attend society functions in London, which means he is here, in Derbyshire, and he is lonely. Lonely men make decisions they might not otherwise make. Lonely men are persuadable. You want one of us to catch him?" Constance said slowly. "I want one of you to be kind, attentive, and charming. I want you to listen to him sympathetically when he speaks of his troubles. I want you to make him feel understood and appreciated. And yes, if possible, I want one of you to catch him. Any one of you. I am not particular at this point." There was a rustling sound, as though Lady Margaret were moving away from the fire. "Now, as for Isabel, I want her kept as far from Count Rothwell as possible. Seat her at the opposite end of the table. Do not allow her to monopolize conversation. If she attempts to draw his attention, one of you will interrupt. Am I understood?" "Yes, Mamma," came the chorus of dutiful responses. "Good. Now go and prepare yourselves. He will be here within the hour, and I expect each of you to look your absolute best. Constance, do something about your hair. Catherine, that dress makes you look sallow. Choose another. Amelia, for God's sake, try to smile. You always look as though you are about to cry." Footsteps approached the door. Isabel moved. Quickly, quietly, she slipped down the corridor toward the main staircase, her slippers making no sound on the thick carpet. Her heart was racing, her face flushed with humiliation and something fiercer, something that felt dangerously close to rage. Nobody. Nothing. She reached the staircase and paused, one hand on the banister. She should go to her room. She should compose herself, wash her face, prepare for the ordeal of dinner. She should put on her grey silk dress, the one her aunt had already criticized a dozen times, and she should go downstairs and sit at the far end of the table like a good, grateful, obedient nothing, and she should watch while her cousins fluttered around Count Rothwell like moths around a flame. She should do all of these things, but suddenly, desperately, she could not. She could not sit through another dinner being treated like an embarrassment to be hidden. She could not endure another evening of watching her aunt's cold eyes track her every movement, looking for flaws to point out later. She could not bear to be in that house for one more moment. She needed air, space, silence, somewhere, anywhere. That was not here. Isabel turned and began walking, not toward her bedroom in the family wing, but away from it, deeper into the house, toward the guest wing where visitors stayed when Thornhill House entertained overnight. Those rooms would be empty now, dark and quiet and blessedly free of voices that cut like knives. The corridor grew dimmer as she moved further from the main areas of the house. Fewer candles were lit here, and the grey afternoon light filtering through tall windows did little to illuminate the shadows. Rain continued its relentless drumming against the glass. She walked faster, almost running now, driven by a need to escape that felt animal and instinctive. Her breath came quick and shallow. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she would not let them fall. She had cried too much already in the 2 years since she had come to live here. She had shed too many tears in the privacy of her room, sobbing into her pillow where no one could hear, and use her grief as further evidence of her weakness. Not any more. No more tears. No more grateful smiles. No more pretending that this was bearable. She reached a door at the end of the corridor and pushed it open without thinking, without checking to see if it was locked or occupied. She simply needed somewhere to hide, somewhere to breathe, somewhere to exist for just a few moments without being observed and judged and found wanting. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the grey light from a single tall window and the faint glow of embers dying in the fireplace. It was warm, blessedly warm after the chill of the corridors, and it smelled of something pleasant, sandalwood, leather, something else she could not quite name. Isabel stepped inside and closed the door behind her, leaning back against it with her eyes closed, finally allowing herself to breathe properly. And then a voice spoke from the darkness near the window. "Who enters my chambers?" The voice was male, low and careful, with an edge of surprise that suggested its owner had been expecting solitude and was now confronting an unexpected intrusion. Isabel's eyes flew open. Her hand went to her throat in an instinctive gesture of shock. There was a man in the room. He stood near the window, partially silhouetted against the grey light. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she could make out more details. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark trousers and a white shirt that he was in the process of buttoning. His coat lay discarded over the back of a chair. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it, and his face, what she could see of it, was handsome but drawn, marked by the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical tiredness. Count Alexander Rothwell? It had to be. No one else would be in the guest chambers at this hour, which meant she had just fled directly into the room of the man her aunt had specifically ordered her to avoid. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Isabel stood frozen against the door, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. The Count stood equally still, his hands paused on the buttons of his shirt, his grey-green eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not quite read. "Forgive me," Isabel finally managed, her voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. I thought this room was empty. I should not have intruded. I will leave immediately." She reached for the door handle behind her, but before she could turn it, the Count spoke again. "Wait." It was not quite a command, but neither was it a request. Something in between. Something that made her hand still on the handle without quite knowing why. The Count took a step toward her, still moving carefully, as though approaching something wild that might bolt at any sudden movement. In the better light, she could see his face more clearly now. He was perhaps 30 or 31 years old, with strong features and eyes that looked as though they had seen things he wished he could forget. There was a weariness to him, a weight that had nothing to do with the hour or the weather. "You are hiding," he said. It was not a question. Isabel swallowed hard. Yes, I apologize. This was foolish. I will go." "From what are you hiding?" The question surprised her. She had expected anger at the intrusion, or perhaps embarrassment at being caught in a state of partial undress. She had not expected this quiet curiosity, this tone of voice that suggested genuine interest rather than accusation. She hesitated. How could she possibly explain? How could she tell this stranger, this nobleman who was a guest in her aunt's house, that she had been hiding from the sound of her own worthlessness being discussed in clinical detail? "From voices," she said finally. "From words that cut. From a house that feels too small to contain everything I'm supposed to pretend not to feel." The Count was quiet for a moment. Then, to her utter astonishment, he nodded slowly as though this made perfect sense. "Gus, I understand," he said simply, and somehow impossibly Isabel believed him. He moved to the small table near the window and poured something from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses. "Brandy," he said, offering one to her. "You look as though you need it. I know I do." Isabel knew she should refuse, should maintain some pretense of propriety, should not be in this room at all, let alone accepting alcohol from a gentleman to whom she had not even been properly introduced. But she was so tired of should. She took the glass. The Count gestured toward a chair near the fire. "Please, sit. You are shaking." She was shaking. She had not realized it until he said it, but her hands were trembling, her whole body vibrating with the aftermath of shock and the lingering effects of what she had overheard. Isabel moved to the chair and sat, grateful for the support. She took a small sip of the brandy. It burned, but it was a clean burn, warming rather than painful, and it helped push back some of the coldness that had settled into her bones. The Count remained standing near the window, maintaining a careful distance. He finished buttoning his shirt and tucked it into his trousers with quick, efficient movements. Even this simple act carried a strange intimacy, something Isabel had never witnessed before. She looked away, focusing on the fire. "You must think me quite mad," she said quietly, "bursting into your room like some sort of lunatic." "On the contrary," the Count replied, "I think you are someone who has been pushed to the point where escape becomes necessary. I recognize the impulse. I indulge in it myself with some regularity." She looked up at him, surprised. "Yes, but you are Count Rothwell. You have position, wealth, freedom. What could you possibly need to escape from?" Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or bitter amusement. "Position is a cage as surely as poverty is, Miss—" "I am Isabel Thornwood," she said quietly. "Lady Margaret's niece. I live here, or rather, I exist here. There is a difference. Miss Thornwood," he inclined his head slightly. "Alexander Rothwell. Though I suspect you had already deduced that—" "I had heard you were expected for dinner," Isabel admitted, "though I confess I did not realize you had already arrived." "I came early," Alexander said. "Too early, as it turns out. Lady Thornhill was not expecting me for another hour, and the servants were in some confusion about which room to prepare. I was shown here and told to make myself comfortable while they sorted matters out. I have been attempting to make myself presentable after several days of travel." He stopped and simply added, "I am hiding too, in a certain way." Isabel looked at him, surprised. "You?" "I accepted Lady Thornhill's invitation to stay here for a few days. She insisted it would be more convenient, something about discussing property boundaries and drainage issues between our estates." A slight, rueful smile crossed his face. "Of course, I knew that was merely pretense. The real purpose is to keep me under this roof long enough for her daughters to make their attempts at securing my interest. I could have refused, should have, probably, insisted on returning to Rothwell Park each evening. But I accepted anyway, because the alternative was going back to that empty house and sitting alone, remembering my failures." He paused, and something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or regret. But he did not elaborate further. "So here I am," he continued, "a guest who knows he is being hunted, pretending not to notice while his hostess pretends her intentions are purely neighborly. We are both hiding, it seems, you from cruel words, and I from my own thoughts." "I am sorry," Isabel said quietly. "I know exactly what you mean." Their eyes met across the dim room, and something passed between them, a recognition, immediate and profound. Two people who had been diminished by circumstances beyond their control, who had learned what it meant to be judged by others and found wanting, looking at each other and seeing not the surface judgments, but something deeper, something real. "Tell me, Miss Thornwood," Alexander said gently, "these cruel words you are hiding from, do they come from your aunt?" Isabel hesitated, then nodded. "Among others, but yes, primarily from her." "And what does she say that drives you to seek refuge in empty rooms?" "That I am nobody," Isabel said, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. "Nothing. That I am a burden, an embarrassment, that my only value is my face, and even that is more curse than blessing because it—" She stopped herself, suddenly aware of how much she was revealing to a complete stranger. Because it draws attention that she would prefer directed elsewhere, Alexander finished quietly. Toward her daughters, perhaps. Isabel looked at him in surprise. You are perceptive. I am observant. There is a difference. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved away from the dresser and crossed the room to her. Not too close, still maintaining a careful distance that propriety demanded, but close enough that she could see the expression on his face clearly in the firelight. Miss Thornwood, may I speak plainly? I wish you would. Your aunt is wrong about you. The statement was so simple, so direct, that Isabel felt tears spring to her eyes before she could prevent them. You do not know me, she whispered. How can you possibly say that? I know what I see, and I see someone who has been badly treated by people who should have protected her. I see someone who, despite that treatment, has maintained enough dignity and self-respect to recognize cruelty for what it is. Someone who runs not because she is weak, but because she is strong enough to know when to preserve herself. He paused. These are not the qualities of someone who is nothing. Isabel pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the sob that wanted to escape. No one had spoken to her this way in years. No one had looked at her and seen anything beyond a pretty face or a financial burden. No one had suggested that she might have value simply for existing. I am sorry, Alexander said gently. I have upset you. That was not my intention. No, Isabel managed. You have not upset me. You have reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. That perhaps I am not entirely what they say I am. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the rain against the windows and the faint crackle of the dying fire. He extended his hand toward her, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. I see someone I would very much like to know better. Isabel looked at his hand. She knew what accepting it would mean. Not just the physical touch, though that alone was improper enough, but the acknowledgement that something had passed between them, some connection that went beyond ordinary social pleasantries. And she knew with absolute certainty that she should not take that hand, should not encourage this, should not allow herself to hope that this man, this count who was so far above her station even in his disgrace, could ever be more to her than a chance encounter in a dark room. But when she looked up at his face, she saw something there that made all those sensible thoughts scatter like leaves in wind. She saw the same loneliness she felt, the same hunger to be truly seen, the same desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, one was not quite as alone as one had believed. Slowly, carefully, Isabel lifted her hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. Neither of them moved beyond that. Neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, hands clasped, looking at each other in the dim firelight, and felt the weight of their shared understanding settle around them like a cloak. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Somewhere in the house, servants were preparing for dinner. Lady Margaret was no doubt arranging her daughters like chess pieces, preparing her strategy for ensnaring the visiting count. But in this room, in this moment, Isabel and Alexander existed outside of all that. Two people who had been wandering lost in their own separate darknesses, who had stumbled into each other quite by accident, and who recognized in the other something that felt achingly like home. After what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, Alexander released her hand. You should go, he said quietly, before someone comes looking for you. Before this situation becomes even more compromising than it already is. Isabel nodded, though she found herself reluctant to move. Yes, I should. She stood and smoothed her skirts with trembling hands. She moved toward the door, then hesitated. Count Rothwell, Alexander, I do not know how to thank you. For the kindness, for listening, for making me feel, even if only for a moment, as though I might be worth something after all. You are worth everything, Alexander said firmly. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. Isabel's hand was on the door handle when he spoke again. Miss Thornwood, Alexander said finally, I realize this is highly irregular. We have only just met. and under circumstances that would horrify every matron in England. But I wonder, would you grant me the honor of continuing this conversation? Not now, of course. The household will be looking for both of us soon. But perhaps tomorrow. Tomorrow, Isabel repeated, confused. I ride most mornings, early, before the household wakes, through the woods between our properties. It is the only time I feel truly at peace. He looked at her with an expression that was both hopeful and vulnerable. If you also ride at such hours, we might encounter each other. By accident, of course. Isabel understood what he was offering. A chance to talk again, away from watchful eyes and listening ears, a chance to be seen, truly seen, by someone who did not view her as a burden or a threat. She felt a smile tug at her lips, despite everything. By accident? Of course. Good night, Miss Thornwood. Good night, Count Rothwell. She slipped from the room as quietly as she had entered it, closing the door with barely a sound. The corridor outside was still empty, still dim. No one had seen her enter. No one saw her leave. But as she made her way back toward her own chambers, her hand still tingling where he had held it, Isabel felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. Dangerous. Fragile. Foolish hope. But hope nonetheless. Dinner that evening was exactly as terrible as Isabel had anticipated, though in ways she had not quite expected. She had returned to her room and taken extra time to compose herself, washing her face in cool water until the evidence of tears and emotion had faded from her features. She had changed into her grey silk dress, the one her aunt criticized regularly, but which was nevertheless the best she owned. She had arranged her golden hair as neatly as she could manage without a maid's help, pinning it up in a simple style that was modest, but, she hoped, reasonably attractive. Then she had gone downstairs, steeling herself for the ordeal ahead. The family had gathered in the drawing room before dinner. Lady Margaret held court near the fire, her 3 daughters arrayed around her like soldiers awaiting orders. Constance wore a dress of pale pink that did nothing for her complexion. Catherine had chosen deep green that made her look sallow. Amelia, at least, looked relatively pleasant in cream muslin. "Ah, Isabel," Lady Margaret said as she entered, her voice carrying that particular edge of false warmth that was somehow worse than open hostility. "How kind of you to join us. I was beginning to wonder if you intended to hide in your room all evening." "Forgive me, Aunt," Isabel said quietly. "I was delayed." "No matter. You are here now. Come, stand here by the window. The light there is quite dim. It will suit you." The subtle cruelty was automatic, reflexive. Stand by the window where the poor light would make her less visible, where gentlemen callers would be less likely to notice her. So Isabel moved to the indicated spot without protest. Count Rothwell was announced shortly thereafter. He entered the drawing room looking every inch the aristocrat, despite his recent disgrace. He had changed into evening clothes of impeccable quality, dark coat and trousers, pristine white shirt, perfectly tied cravat. His hair had been properly arranged. His boots gleamed. If Isabel had not seen him less than 2 hours ago looking exhausted and disheveled in his shirt sleeves, she might have thought him the picture of noble composure. But she had seen him. And when his eyes found hers across the room, she saw beneath the polished surface to the man underneath. The lonely, wounded, kind man who had held her hand and told her she was worth everything. "Count Rothwell," Lady Margaret gushed, sweeping forward with her daughters trailing behind her like ducklings. "How absolutely delightful to have you here at last. May I present my daughters? This is Constance, my eldest, and Catherine, and my youngest, Amelia." Each girl curtsied in turn. Alexander acknowledged them with perfect courtesy, but Isabel could see that his attention was not truly engaged. His eyes kept sliding past her cousins, searching the room, until they found her again standing half-shadowed by the window. "And this," Lady Margaret said, her voice taking on that particular tone of dismissive charity, "is my niece, Miss Isabel Thornwood. She has been residing with us since the tragic loss of her parents some years ago. Quite the little charity case, though we do our best for her." The casual cruelty of it, spoken so pleasantly in front of a guest, made Isabel's cheeks burn. She curtsied without meeting Alexander's eyes, not trusting herself to maintain composure if she looked at him directly. Miss Thornwood, Alexander said, and there was something in his voice, some underlying warmth, that made Lady Margaret's eyes narrow slightly. I'm very sorry for your loss. You are too kind, my lord, Isabel murmured. Not at all. Loss is loss, regardless of how much time has passed. Grief does not observe society's convenient timetables. There was a brief silence. Lady Margaret's smile had become fixed and slightly dangerous. She had clearly noticed something in Alexander's tone that she did not like, some hint of genuine sympathy that threatened to disrupt her carefully laid plans. Well, she said briskly, shall we go into dinner? I'm sure Count Rothwell must be famished after his journey. The dining room had been arranged exactly as Lady Margaret had described in her earlier conversation with her daughters. Alexander was seated between Constance and Catherine, with Amelia directly across from him. Isabel had been placed at the far end of the table, near an elderly neighbour who had been invited to make up numbers and who was mostly deaf and primarily interested in discussing agricultural yields. From her distant position, Isabel could observe but not easily participate in the conversation. She could watch as Constance leaned slightly too close to Alexander while discussing the upcoming local assembly. She could see Catherine batting her eyelashes while asking sweetly about his time on the continent. She could hear Amelia's high, nervous laugh at everything Alexander said, whether it was amusing or not. And she could see, because she was watching for it, the way Alexander's attention kept drifting away from her cousins, the way his eyes kept finding hers down the length of the table, the way he seemed to be enduring the conversation rather than enjoying it. Halfway through the second course, Lady Margaret decided to draw blood. Isabel, my dear, she called down the table, her voice carrying clearly over the other conversations. Did you ever respond to Mr. Wickham's letter? You remember the kind gentleman who expressed such interest in your welfare last month? Every conversation stopped, every eye turned to Isabel. She felt her face grow hot. No, Aunt Margaret, I did not feel that a connection was appropriate. How very particular you are, Lady Margaret said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. One might think, given your circumstances, that you would be more receptive to respectable offers of marriage. But I suppose when one is blessed with beauty, one can afford to be choosy, even when one has absolutely nothing else whatsoever to recommend one. The silence that followed was excruciating. Isabel stared at her plate, her hands clenched in her lap beneath the table. She could feel tears threatening, but she would not, absolutely would not, let them fall in front of all these people. I would think, Alexander's voice cut through the silence like a knife, cool and precise, that any woman of intelligence and character would be wise to be selective in matters of marriage, regardless of her material circumstances. Marriage is not, after all, a business transaction, despite how often we treat it as such. Lady Margaret's smile became brittle. How very modern of you, Count Rothwell, though I confess I am surprised to hear such sentiments from a man of your station. Surely you understand the practical realities of matrimony. I understand, Alexander said, and his eyes were fixed on Lady Margaret with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably in her chair. That there are things more valuable than money or connections. Integrity, for instance, kindness, the courage to maintain one's dignity in difficult circumstances. He looked directly at Isabel as he said this last part. Lady Margaret's jaw tightened visibly. She had clearly not expected the evening to go this way, had not anticipated that Alexander would defend rather than ignore the poor relation she had worked so hard to diminish. The rest of the meal passed in strained, near silence, the earlier attempts at charm and flirtation abandoned in favor of uncomfortable formality. When the ladies finally withdrew to the drawing room after dinner, leaving Alexander briefly alone with his port as custom dictated, Lady Margaret rounded on Isabel immediately. "What?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Did you do?" Isabel looked at her aunt in confusion. "I beg your pardon. Do not play innocent with me. What did you do to make Count Rothwell take such an interest in defending you? Did you encounter him before dinner? Did you manufacture some pathetic meeting designed to appeal to his sympathies?" "I did nothing," Isabel said, which was technically true, even if it was also deeply misleading. "Then why is he looking at you the way he is? Why is he defending you instead of paying attention to Constance or Catherine? I do not know, Aunt. Perhaps he simply believes that basic courtesy should be extended to all guests in one's home, regardless of their circumstances. It was the wrong thing to say. Isabel knew it was the wrong thing to say, even as the words left her mouth, but she was too tired, too emotionally raw from the day's events, to properly guard her tongue. Lady Margaret's eyes blazed. You ungrateful little wretch. After everything I have done for you, taking you in when you had nowhere else to go, providing you with food and shelter and clothing, this is how you repay me, by insulting my hospitality and attempting to steal the attention of a guest I specifically invited for my daughters. I have stolen nothing, Isabel said quietly. I have barely spoken to Count Rothwell. Your presence is theft enough. Your face is theft. Every moment you spend in a room with available gentlemen is a theft from girls who actually deserve their attention. Lady Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice so that only Isabel could hear. Let me be perfectly clear, niece. You will stay away from Count Rothwell. You will not speak to him unless directly addressed. You will not put yourself forward in any way. And if I see you making any attempt whatsoever to encourage his attention, I will make your life here so unbearable that you will beg to accept the next Mr. Wickham who comes along, regardless of his age or his habits. Do I make myself understood? Yes, Aunt Margaret, Isabel whispered. Good. Now go to your room. You have a headache. You are indisposed. You will not be joining us when Count Rothwell comes through from the dining room. It was a dismissal and a humiliation all at once. To be sent away like a child before the gentleman had even returned. Isabel curtsied stiffly and left the drawing room, walking with as much dignity as she could muster, despite the fact that her hands were shaking and her vision was blurred with unshed tears. She made it to the main staircase before the tears actually fell. She climbed quickly, holding her skirts up with trembling hands, desperate to reach the privacy of her room before she completely fell apart. The corridor on the upper floor was dim and quiet. Most of the servants were still busy downstairs with dinner. No one saw her pass. She reached her bedroom door and fumbled with the handle, her hands shaking too badly to grip it properly. Finally, she managed to push it open and stumbled inside. Only then, alone at last, did she allow herself to cry in earnest. Great gasping sobs that she muffled against her hand so that no one in the neighboring rooms would hear. She sank down onto her narrow bed and wept for everything she had lost, everything she was forced to endure, everything she could not change no matter how much she wished she could. She cried until she had no tears left, until her eyes were swollen and her throat was raw, and her head ached with a pain that was entirely real and had nothing to do with the fictional headache her aunt had invented. And then, exhausted beyond measure, she simply lay there in the darkness and wondered how much longer she could possibly continue living this way. Isabel barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that encounter in Alexander's chambers, the way he had looked at her, the gentleness in his voice when he asked what she was hiding from, the simple, devastating kindness of his words, "You are worth everything." No one had spoken to her that way in years. Perhaps no one ever had, not even her parents, who had loved her but in the comfortable, unquestioned way of people who had never known real hardship or cruelty. Alexander had seen her pain and acknowledged it, had recognized her worth without needing to be convinced, had offered friendship, or perhaps something more, without expecting anything in return. It was dangerous to let herself feel hope. Hope led to disappointment. Hope made the inevitable fall that much more painful, but Isabel could not help it. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps there was a future beyond this house, beyond her aunt's cruelty, beyond the slow suffocation of her current existence. She rose before dawn, when the house was still silent and dark. She dressed quickly in her riding habit, the faded blue one that was genuinely hers rather than an altered hand-me-down, and slipped from her room like a ghost. The stables were quiet when she arrived, with only the head groom Harris already awake and beginning the morning feed. "Early start today, Miss Isabel," he said with a respectful nod, showing no surprise. He was used to her dawn rides by now. "The rain has finally stopped," Isabel said. "I thought I would take advantage of the clear morning." Harris helped her saddle Daisy, the gentle mare she had been permitted to ride during her time at Thornhill House, and Isabel guided the horse out of the stable yard and onto the path that led toward the woods. The morning air was cool and fresh, scented with damp earth and pine. Mist clung to the ground between the trees, and everything was very quiet except for birdsong and the soft sound of Daisy's hooves on the forest path. Isabel told herself she was not looking for him. She was simply riding, as she often did when weather permitted, seeking the peace and freedom that the woods offered. But her heart was racing, and she could not deny the hope that fluttered in her chest like a caged bird desperate for flight. She reached the fork in the path where Thornhill land met Rothwell land and drew Daisy to a stop, uncertain whether to continue or wait. And then she saw him. Alexander sat astride a large grey stallion, waiting at the edge of the clearing as though he had been there for some time. He was dressed simply in riding clothes without the formal coat and cravat, and when he saw her, his face broke into a smile of such genuine joy that Isabel felt warmth flood through her entire body. "Miss Thornwood," he called, "what a pleasant coincidence." "Count Rothwell," Isabel replied, unable to suppress her own smile. "I did not expect to encounter anyone this early." "Nor did I." He guided his stallion closer. "Harris, though I confess I am very glad for the company. These woods are beautiful but lonely at dawn. Would you ride with me?" It was improper. They had no chaperone. They were alone in the woods with no one to observe the proper conventions. "I would like that very much," Isabel said. They rode side by side through the forest, not speaking at first, simply enjoying the quiet peace of the morning. The mist was beginning to burn off as the sun climbed higher, and shafts of golden light filtered through the trees. Eventually they reached a clearing where a stream ran clear over smooth stones, and Alexander dismounted to let his horse drink. He helped Isabel down from Daisy, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Even through her riding habit, she could feel the warmth of his touch. For a moment they stood very close, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of beard along his jaw, the exact shade of grey-green in his eyes. Then he stepped back, maintaining propriety even here where no one could see them. "I hoped you would come," he said quietly. "Just after last night's dinner, I was not certain whether your aunt might have somehow discovered our meeting and forbidden you to leave the house." "She does not know," Isabel said, "though she did warn me to stay away from you. She made it quite clear that any attempt on my part to secure your attention would be met with severe consequences." Alexander's expression darkened. "She said this to you? After that dinner? After the way she spoke to you in front of guests?" "It is nothing I have not heard before. My aunt has been making her feelings about my presence quite clear for 2 years now." "It is not nothing," Alexander said firmly. "It is cruelty. Deliberate or calculated cruelty designed to make you feel worthless so that she might feel powerful." They walked a short distance from the horses, toward a fallen log that provided a natural seat overlooking the stream. Isabel sat, grateful for the support, and Alexander settled beside her, maintaining a careful few inches of distance. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not the things your aunt would say, not the official story of the poor orphaned niece. Tell me who you really are, Isabel. What you care about, what you dream of when you allow yourself to dream." And so she told him. She told him about growing up as an adored only child, about her father who had encouraged her to read anything she wished from his extensive library, about her mother who had been beautiful, but also intelligent and kind, who had shown Isabel that a woman could be both lovely and learned without apology. She told him about summers spent by the sea, about falling in love with the wildness of the ocean and the sense of infinite possibility that came from standing on a beach and looking out toward the horizon. She told him about the books she loved, poetry and philosophy and novels that transported her to worlds where women could have adventures and make their own choices, about her secret dreams of traveling, of seeing Venice and Paris and Rome, of experiencing things beyond the narrow confines of an English country house. She told him about the night she received the letter about her parents' deaths, how the world had seemed to tilt and never quite right itself again, about the funeral where distant relatives discussed her future as though she were a piece of furniture to be allocated among various households, about arriving at Thornhill House and realizing within days that her aunt viewed her not as family, but as an obligation and an inconvenience. "I try to be grateful," she said softly. "I know there are women in far worse circumstances. I have food, shelter, safety. But sometimes I lie awake at night and wonder if this is simply what life is now, if this is all there will ever be. An endless succession of small humiliations and quiet loneliness, until eventually I am old enough that no one expects anything of me anymore." Alexander had been listening with complete attention, his eyes never leaving her face. Now he reached for her hand, holding it gently in his own. "That is not all there will be," he said firmly. "You are 24 years old. You have most of your life still ahead of you. And I refuse to believe that you are destined to spend it being slowly diminished by people who are threatened by everything you are." "Pretty words," Isabel said, though she did not pull her hand away. "But words do not change material circumstances." "Perhaps not, but circumstances can change. With effort, with courage, with help from people who see your worth and wish to support you in claiming the life you deserve." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Isabel, I realize I have known you less than a day. I realize that anything I say now must sound presumptuous, but I must say it anyway. When I saw you yesterday standing in my chambers looking lost and afraid and heartbreakingly brave, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Recognition, connection, the sense that perhaps I was not quite as alone as I had believed myself to be." "I felt it too," Isabel admitted quietly. "Then let us see where this leads. Let us meet like this, in these woods, where we can speak freely without your aunt's interference. Let us come to know each other as people, not as the roles society has assigned us, and then, if what we feel proves genuine and lasting, we will face whatever consequences come together." Isabel's heart was racing. "You speak as though there might be a future in this. But Alexander, you are a count. I am nobody, nothing, exactly as my aunt says. Even if you wish to court me openly, your family, your friends, everyone would object. I do not care what they think," Alexander interrupted. "I have learned through bitter experience that reputation is fragile and largely meaningless. What I care about is building a life that has genuine meaning and purpose, and I believe—" He stopped, took a breath. "And I believe that a life spent with someone like you, someone who understands what it means to suffer and has chosen nevertheless to remain kind, would have both." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that was both chaste and deeply intimate. "I am not asking you to accept a proposal today. We barely know each other. But I am asking for time. Time to meet like this, to talk, to discover whether what we feel is real. Will you give me that?" Isabel knew all the reasons she should say no, knew that this was dangerous, that if they were discovered her aunt would make her life unbearable, that even if Alexander's intentions were honorable, he was still a count, and she was still a woman without fortune or connections. But when she looked at his face, saw the genuine hope and vulnerability in his eyes, all those sensible reasons seemed to matter very little. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Alexander's face broke into a smile of pure joy. Thank you for trusting me, for giving me this chance. I promise you, Isabel, I will do everything in my power to prove myself worthy of it." They sat together by the stream for another hour, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and hopes and small everyday preferences. They laughed together over shared observations. They fell into comfortable silences that required no words. And when the sun had climbed high enough that they knew they must return before their absences were noted, Alexander helped Isabel mount Daisy, his hands lingering at her waist just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Isabel confirmed. She rode back toward Thornhill House, with her heart lighter than it had been in years, unaware that as she and Alexander had been sitting together by that stream, speaking words of tentative promise and fragile hope, Lady Margaret's lady's maid had been walking through those same woods, gathering herbs as her mistress had instructed her to do each morning, and had seen everything. They met every morning for the next 2 weeks. Each dawn, Isabel would slip from Thornhill House while everyone slept and ride to the woods, and each dawn, Alexander would be there waiting, his face lighting up when he saw her approaching. They rode through different parts of the forest, discovering new paths and hidden clearings. They sat by the stream and talked for hours about everything and nothing. They laughed together over shared jokes and comfortable silences that required no words. With each meeting, Isabel felt herself falling deeper into something she was not quite ready to name, but which felt increasingly like love. Alexander was kind and intelligent and genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He treated her as an equal rather than a burden. He looked at her and saw not a beautiful face or a charity case, but a complete person whose inner life mattered, and she could see that he was changing too. The weariness that had marked him when they first met was slowly lifting. He smiled more easily. He spoke about his future with something approaching optimism. "You have given me something I did not realize I had lost," he told her one morning as they sat together by the stream. "Purpose, hope, a reason to wake up each day and believe that life might hold more than regret and disappointment." "You have given me the same," Isabel replied softly. "You have reminded me that I am more than what my circumstances have made me, that I have value beyond what others choose to see." Alexander reached for her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over these 2 weeks. "Isabel, I need to tell you something. I need you to know that what I feel for you is not simply gratitude or temporary attraction. It is deeper than that, more permanent." Isabel's breath caught. "Alexander, I am falling in love with you," he said simply. "I suspect I began falling in love with you the moment you walked into my chambers looking lost and afraid and heartbreakingly brave. And every moment I spend with you makes me more certain that you are exactly the person I have been searching for, without knowing I was searching." Tears sprang to Isabel's eyes. "I feel the same. I tried not to. I tried to be sensible, to protect myself, to remember all the reasons this could never work. But I cannot help it. I love you, Alexander. Completely, impossibly. I love you." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Then, we must do something about this situation. We cannot continue meeting in secret indefinitely. It is not fair to you, and it does not honor what we feel for each other." "What are you suggesting?" "In 3 days, there is to be an assembly in the village, a small affair, but all the local families will attend. Your aunt will certainly take her daughters, and I assume you will be required to accompany them." "Most likely," Isabel said. "Then I will be there as well, and I will ask you to dance. Publicly, before everyone. It will be a statement of my intentions, Isabel. It will make clear that I am courting you seriously and honorably. And then, if you will have me, I will propose, properly, formally, in a way that leaves no doubt about my commitment to you." Isabel's heart was racing. "My aunt will be furious. She will try to stop it. Alexander, you do not understand how vindictive she can be when she feels threatened." "Then let her be furious," Alexander said firmly. "I am not afraid of Lady Margaret Thornhill, and once we are engaged, there will be nothing she can do to separate us. I am a grown man with my own estate and my own income. I do not require anyone's permission to marry whom I choose." "But your reputation is already damaged," Alexander interrupted, "and I have learned that reputation is far less important than happiness. I would rather be scandalously happy with you than respectably miserable alone." He cupped her face gently in his hands. 3 days, Isabel. Can you endure 3 more days? And then we step into the light together and let whatever comes, come." "Yes," Isabel whispered. 3 days. I can manage that." Alexander leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Isabel did not pull away. She closed the distance between them and felt his lips brush against hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they finally parted, both of them were smiling. "I should go," Isabel said reluctantly. "The household will be waking soon, and I should return to Rothwell Park before my staff begins to wonder why their master disappears every dawn." Alexander helped her mount Daisy, his hands lingering at her waist. "Tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow," Isabel confirmed. She rode back toward Thornhill House with her heart full of hope and joy and terrifying anticipation. 3 more days, 3 more dawn meetings, and then everything would change. She did not see the figure watching from behind a large oak tree as she and Alexander parted. Lady Margaret's maid, Prudence, had been sent to gather herbs in these woods early each morning for the past week, instructed to observe and report anything unusual. And this morning, she had seen everything. On the afternoon of the second day, Alexander made a formal call at Thornhill House. It was the proper thing to do, to establish his presence as a neighbor with legitimate reasons to visit, to make his interest in the family, and particularly in Isabel, known in a socially acceptable way. Lady Margaret received him in the drawing-room with excessive warmth, clearly believing that his visit meant renewed interest in one of her daughters. Constance, Catherine, and Amelia were summoned and arranged attractively around the room. Isabel was also present, seated near the window with needlework she was not actually completing. "Count Rothwell, what a delightful surprise," Lady Margaret gushed. "We have missed your company these past weeks. I do hope you have been well." "Quite well, thank you," Alexander replied politely. "I have been occupied with matters on my estate, but I realized I have been remiss in my social obligations. I thought I might take advantage of your excellent library, if you would permit it. I understand the late Lord Thornhill had an impressive collection of books on agricultural improvement, which would be most helpful to me as I consider changes to my own land management." It was a perfectly reasonable request from a neighboring gentleman, and Lady Margaret could hardly refuse without appearing churlish. "So of course," she said, though her smile had tightened slightly. "The library is at your disposal. Perhaps one of my daughters might show you the way. Constance is quite familiar with her late father's collection." "That is very kind," Alexander said, "but I would not wish to trouble Miss Constance. Perhaps Miss Thornwood might assist me. I recall from our previous meeting that she seems well acquainted with the library's contents." The request was perfectly proper, yet Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Isabel knows nothing of agricultural texts. She reads poetry and novels. Useless feminine nonsense. Surely Constance would be more helpful." "Nevertheless," Alexander said calmly, "I would appreciate Miss Thornwood's company, if she is willing, of course." All eyes turned to Isabel. She set down her needlework with trembling hands. "I would be happy to assist, Count Rothwell." Lady Margaret's jaw tightened, but she could not refuse without creating a scene. "Very well, but leave the door open, Isabel. Propriety must be observed." Isabel led Alexander to the library, very aware of her aunt's furious gaze following them down the corridor. Once inside, Alexander closed the door to within a few inches, not shut but providing some measure of privacy. "That was dangerous," Isabel whispered. "She knows something is happening between us. I could see it in her face." "Let her know," Alexander said. "In 2 days it will not matter, but I wanted to see you in daylight, in your home, to see how you exist in this space where you have been so unhappy. And I wanted to tell you something." He moved closer, not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I have been to speak with my solicitor this morning. I have instructed him to prepare a marriage settlement that will ensure you are provided for independently, regardless of what happens to me. You will have your own income, your own funds, complete financial security. You will never again be dependent on anyone's charity or goodwill." Isabel's eyes filled with tears. "Alexander, you do not need to do that." "Yes, I do. Because I want you to choose to marry me, knowing that you are choosing me, not choosing escape from your current circumstances. I want you to be certain that this is what you want, not simply what you need." "I am certain," Isabel said firmly. "I have never been more certain of anything. I love you, Alexander. Not for your title or your money or your ability to rescue me. I love you because you are kind and honest, and because you see me as I truly am and value what you see." Alexander smiled, and it was a smile of such pure happiness that it transformed his entire face. "Then in 2 days I will ask you properly, before everyone, and we will begin the life we both deserve." They spent another 20 minutes in the library, ostensibly examining agricultural texts, actually speaking in low voices about their hopes for the future. When they emerged, Lady Margaret was waiting in the corridor, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "I trust you found what you needed, Count Rothwell," she asked coldly. "Indeed, Miss Thornwood was most helpful." "Thank you for your hospitality, Lady Margaret." He left, and Lady Margaret rounded on Isabel the moment the front door closed behind him. "What," she hissed, "is happening between you and Count Rothwell?" "Nothing improper," Isabel said carefully. "He is a neighbor making use of the library, that is all. Do not lie to me. I have eyes. I have seen the way he looks at you. And I have heard reports—" She stopped herself, clearly not wanting to reveal how she had been having Isabel watched. "You will stay away from him. Do you understand me? You will not encourage his attention in any way. And if he seeks my company regardless, then you will refuse it, or I will make your life here so unbearable that you will wish you had never been born." It was not an empty threat. Isabel knew her aunt was capable of extraordinary cruelty when motivated, but she also knew that in 2 days it would not matter. In 2 days, Alexander would propose publicly, and Lady Margaret's power over her would finally end. "Yes, Aunt Margaret," Isabel said quietly, but in her heart she was counting the hours until the assembly. The next days passed with agonizing slowness. Isabel met Alexander in the woods both mornings, and they finalized their plans. The assembly would take place in the evening. Alexander would arrive shortly after the dancing began. He would ask Isabel to dance, making his interest clear to everyone present. And then, before the evening ended, he would propose. "Are you afraid?" he asked her on that final morning, the day of the assembly. "Terrified," Isabel admitted, but also excited, also hopeful, also ready for this to finally be over, one way or another. "It will be over soon," Alexander promised, "and then we begin our real life together." They parted with a kiss, sweet and lingering, both of them aware that this was the last time they would meet in secret. The next time they saw each other, it would be in public before witnesses, with everything revealed. Isabel returned to Thornhill House to prepare for the evening ahead, not knowing that Lady Margaret had already prepared a revelation of her own. The assembly hall was bright with candles and crowded with local families when Isabel arrived with Lady Margaret and her cousins. She wore her grey silk dress, the same one she had worn to every assembly for 2 years, and she held her head high despite knowing that by evening's end she would either be engaged to be married or utterly ruined. Lady Margaret had been strangely pleasant during the carriage ride, which should have been a warning. Her aunt was never pleasant without reason. They entered the hall, and Lady Margaret immediately began her usual routine of positioning her daughters strategically and ensuring everyone knew they were available for dancing. Isabel was directed to stand near the wall, out of the way, as always. But tonight, Isabel did not mind. Tonight, she was waiting for someone. The dancing began. Constance partnered with the elderly widower. Catherine danced with the young clergyman. Amelia sat out the first set, looking miserable. And then Alexander arrived. He entered the hall looking magnificent in formal evening clothes, and his eyes immediately sought Isabel across the room. When he found her, he smiled, and everything else seemed to fade away. He crossed directly to her, ignoring everyone else, his purpose clear. "Miss Thornwood," he said, bowing formally, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" Every conversation in the room stopped. Everyone turned to stare. Isabel placed her hand in his. "Yes, thank you." They moved onto the floor as the musicians began a waltz. Other couples joined them, but Isabel was aware only of Alexander, of his hand at her waist, of the way he looked at her as though she were the only person in the world. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "As ready as I will ever be." They danced, and Isabel let herself sink into the moment, knowing it might be the last peaceful moment they had before everything exploded into chaos. When the dance ended, Alexander did not release her hand. Instead, he led her to the center of the room, where the most people could see them, and then he dropped to one knee. The room went absolutely silent. "Miss Isabel Thornwood," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall, "I realize this may seem sudden to those observing, but I must tell you and tell everyone here that in the short time I have known you, You have become the most important person in my life. You have shown me that there is still goodness and kindness in this world. You have reminded me what it means to hope, to dream, to believe in the possibility of happiness." He withdrew a small velvet box from his coat and opened it, revealing a sapphire ring that caught the candlelight and sparkled brilliantly. "I am not a perfect man. My reputation has been damaged. My past contains failures I can never undo. But I can promise you this. I will spend every day of the rest of my life ensuring that you know you are valued, cherished, and loved. Not for your beauty, though you are beautiful. Not for any advantage you might bring, for you bring only yourself, which is more than enough. But for the extraordinary person you are, intelligent, courageous, kind, and true." He looked directly into her eyes. "Isabel Thornwood, will you marry me?" Isabel felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." The room erupted in applause and excited chatter. Alexander stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, then raised her hand to his lips and kissed it tenderly. And that was when Lady Margaret's voice cut through the celebration like a blade. "Stop this at once!" The applause died away. Everyone turned to look at Lady Margaret, who stood near the refreshment table, her face white with fury. "Oh, this engagement is a sham," Lady Margaret declared, her voice shaking with rage. "A fraud perpetrated by a scheming girl who has entrapped Count Rothwell through deception and impropriety." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Alexander's hand tightened on Isabel's. "Lady Margaret," he said coldly, "you will apologize to Miss Thornwood immediately. Or what?" Lady Margaret interrupted. "You will defend her. When everyone in this room is about to learn exactly what she has been doing. When they learn how she has been meeting you in secret, unchaperoned, in ways that no respectable young woman would ever engage in." She gestured toward her maid, Prudence, who stood nervously near the door. "Come here, Prudence. Tell everyone what you told me. Tell them what you witnessed." Prudence stepped forward reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. I was gathering herbs in the woods, my lady, early in the mornings, as you instructed, and I saw Miss Isabel and Count Rothwell meeting alone. They would ride together and sit together and talk for hours. She swallowed hard. They were alone together, my lady, without any chaperone, multiple times. The murmurs grew louder, more scandalized. Isabel felt her face burning, not with shame, but with anger. "It is true," Isabel said clearly before anyone else could speak. "I did meet Count Rothwell in the woods. I have been meeting him nearly every morning for 2 weeks." Gasps of shock. Lady Margaret smiled triumphantly. "But," Isabel continued, her voice rising, "I will not apologize for it, and I will not allow you to twist something innocent into something sordid simply because it suits your narrative." She turned to address the entire room. "Yes, I met Count Rothwell unchaperoned. Do you know why? Because if I had asked my aunt's permission, she would have refused it, not out of concern for propriety, but because she has spent 2 years doing everything in her power to ensure I remain isolated, unhappy, and completely without prospects. She has humiliated me publicly. She has kept me dressed in a single old gown while spending freely on her own daughters. She has told me repeatedly that I am worthless, that I am nothing, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of charity she deigns to throw my way." Her voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "So yes, when I met a man who treated me with kindness and respect, who saw value in me beyond my face or my lack of fortune, I chose to spend time with him. And if that makes me scandalous in your eyes, so be it. I would rather be scandalous and happy than respectable and miserable." "You were alone with him," Lady Margaret insisted. "You compromised yourself and forced him into this proposal through your shameless behavior." "That is a lie," Alexander said, his voice hard as iron. "And you know it is a lie, Lady Margaret. I proposed to Miss Thornwood because I love her, because she is the finest person I have ever known, and because I will not allow her to spend one more day under your roof, subject to your cruelty." He turned to address the assembled guests. Yes, Miss Thornwood and I met in secret, because her aunt made it impossible for us to meet openly, but our conduct was entirely honorable. We talked. We rode. We came to know each other as people, without the masks we all wear in society, and I discovered that I had found someone extraordinary, someone worth fighting for. "This is a disaster," Lady Margaret said, shaking her head. "You do not understand what you are doing, Count Rothwell. This girl has manipulated you, used her looks to cloud your judgment. Once you are married and the infatuation fades, you will realize what a terrible mistake you have made. The only mistake," a new voice said from the doorway, "would be allowing this to continue." Everyone turned. An elderly gentleman in clerical dress had entered the hall, his expression stern. "Reverend Patterson," Lady Margaret said, clearly surprised, "I did not realize you were attending this evening." "I was not planning to," the Reverend said, walking slowly into the room. "But I received an interesting visitor this afternoon. Count Rothwell came to see me. He wished to discuss arrangements for a wedding, and in the course of that conversation, he told me about his courtship of Miss Thornwood, including the circumstances that made secret meetings necessary." He looked at Lady Margaret with disapproval. "I have known you for many years, Lady Margaret. I married you to your late husband, I christened your daughters, and I am ashamed to say I have observed your treatment of your niece without speaking out. But I will not remain silent any longer." He turned to the assembled guests. "Miss Thornwood lost both her parents in a tragic accident 3 years ago. She came to Lady Margaret's home as a young woman in mourning, in need of family and comfort. And what did she receive? Coldness, cruelty, a systematic campaign to destroy her confidence and ensure she had no prospects for a better future. I have seen it with my own eyes at church services, at community events, and I have said nothing to my shame. But I will not allow Lady Margaret to ruin this young woman's engagement through false accusations and manufactured scandal. Count Rothwell came to me as an honorable man, asking to have bans read, explaining his courtship with honesty and sincerity. I found nothing improper in what he described. Two people meeting to talk and know each other, conducted with discretion but not with shame. That is not scandal. That is simply two people who had the misfortune to begin their acquaintance under difficult circumstances." The Reverend looked directly at Lady Margaret. "You should be happy for your niece. Instead, you seek to destroy her happiness out of spite. That speaks volumes about your character, madam." Lady Margaret's face had gone from white to red. "How dare you?" "I dare because it is the truth," the Reverend said quietly. "And everyone in this room knows it, even if they have been too polite to say so." There was a long, awkward silence. Then an older woman near the refreshment table spoke up. "He is right," she said. "I have watched you treat that poor girl abominably, Margaret. We all have. It has been uncomfortable to witness." "Indeed," another voice agreed. "A gentleman Isabel vaguely recognized as a local landowner. Yes, the girl has always conducted herself with dignity, despite your efforts to humiliate her. Count Rothwell is getting a fine wife, if you ask me." More voices joined in, a chorus of support that grew stronger as people found the courage to speak truths they had kept silent for too long. Lady Margaret looked around at the turning tide of opinion, and Isabel saw something break in her aunt's face. The realization that she had miscalculated, that her attempt to create scandal had backfired completely. "This is outrageous," Lady Margaret said weakly. "I am her guardian. I have a right. You have no rights over her," Alexander said firmly. "Miss Thornwood is 24 years old and legally able to make her own decisions, and she has decided to marry me. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks, by special license. And until that time, Miss Thornwood will be staying at Rothwell Park as the guest of my widowed cousin, who has recently arrived to serve as chaperone. Miss Thornwood will never spend another night under your roof." He looked down at Isabel. "Unless you have objections to this plan." "None whatsoever," Isabel said, smiling through her tears. "Then it is settled." Alexander turned back to Lady Margaret. "You are welcome to attend the wedding, if you choose, but you will not be given any role in it, and you will not be permitted to say or do anything that might upset my future wife. Is that understood?" Lady Margaret said nothing. She simply turned and walked from the hall, her daughters trailing behind her in confusion. The moment she was gone, the hall erupted again, but this time in genuine celebration. People crowded around Isabel and Alexander, offering congratulations, expressing happiness for them both. Isabel felt overwhelmed by it all, by the sudden shift from looming disaster to complete triumph. She leaned into Alexander, letting him support her. "Is it over?" she whispered. "Is it truly over?" "It is over," Alexander assured her. "You are free, Isabel. Free from her, free from this life, and in 3 weeks, you will be my wife." "I can hardly believe it." "Believe it," Alexander said, and kissed her gently on the forehead, not caring who was watching. Spring came to Derbyshire with a softness that felt like a blessing. The gardens at Rothwell Park erupting in waves of colour, as flowers that had been dormant all winter finally awoke. Isabel stood at the window of what was now her bedroom, not a guest room, but the Countess's chamber, beautifully appointed and filled with morning light, and looked out over grounds that belonged to her now as much as they belonged to Alexander. They had been married for 3 months, and she was still not quite accustomed to the happiness of it all, to waking each morning beside a man who loved her, to spending her days doing whatever she pleased, reading, painting, walking through gardens that she was free to enjoy, to being treated by servants not as a charity case to be grudgingly served, but as the mistress of the household whose comfort and happiness were priorities. She heard the door open behind her and turned to see Alexander entering, still in his riding clothes, his hair wind-blown from a morning gallop across the estate. "Good morning," he said, crossing to her and wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well," Isabel said, leaning back into his warmth, "though I woke to find you already gone. I wanted to check on the new foal in the south stables. She was having trouble standing yesterday, but this morning she seems much stronger." He kissed her neck gently. "I am sorry I left without waking you. You looked so peaceful." "I forgive you," Isabel said, smiling, "though you will have to make amends later." "I fully intend to." They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the grounds. In the distance, Isabel could see the woods where they had first met in secret, where they had fallen in love among the trees and morning mist. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked quietly. "The scandal, the gossip, the way we began?" "Never," Isabel said firmly. "How could I regret anything that led to this? To us?" Still, it was difficult. Those first weeks after the assembly, the whispers, the speculation. It was true that their engagement had been the subject of considerable gossip. Some people believed Lady Margaret's version of events, that Isabel had somehow trapped Alexander into marriage. Others had been more charitable, recognizing genuine affection when they saw it. But the wedding had been beautiful regardless. A small ceremony in the village church, with Reverend Patterson officiating and a surprising number of well-wishers in attendance. Lady Margaret had not come. Neither had her daughters. "I do not regret the difficult parts," Isabel said. "They taught me something important. They taught me that I am stronger than I knew, that I can stand up for myself, that I do not have to accept mistreatment simply because someone in authority demands it. Your love gave me the courage to value myself, Alexander. That is not something I will ever regret." Alexander turned her in his arms so that she was facing him. "You know that I love you desperately, do you not? Not for your beauty, though you are beautiful, not for what you have brought to my life, though you have brought everything, but simply for being exactly who you are." "I know," Isabel said softly, "and I love you the same way, completely, without reservation." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, in the way that still made her heart race even after 3 months of marriage. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Alexander smiled. "I have something for you. A gift." "Another one?" "Alexander, you give me gifts constantly. I do not need more." "This one is different," he said, pulling a small key from his pocket. "Do you remember the night we first met, when you fled into my chambers and I was there, and we recognized each other's loneliness?" "Of course I remember." "I have been thinking about that night often, about how you walked into that room looking for safety and found instead something unexpected, found me, Found us. He placed the key in her hand. This is the key to my study. The room where I work, where I keep my private papers and personal correspondence. I want you to have it. Not because you need permission to enter any room in this house. You are the Countess. Every room is yours. But as a symbol, a reminder that there are no locked doors between us, no secrets, no barriers, nothing hidden. Isabel felt tears prick her eyes. Alexander, I want you to know that you are safe here. That this is your home in every sense of the word. That you will never again have to run or hide or fear that the place you live is not truly yours. This house is yours. This life is yours. I am yours, completely and without reservation. Isabel threw her arms around him, holding him tight. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. For seeing me when I felt invisible. For valuing me when I felt worthless. For loving me when I thought I was unlovable. You were never any of those things, Alexander said gently, stroking her hair. You were simply surrounded by people who were too small-minded to recognize your worth. But I saw it. I saw you. And I will spend the rest of my life making certain you never forget how extraordinary you are. They held each other in the morning light. Two people who had been lost and alone, who had found each other by accident and by grace, who had chosen each other despite obstacles and opposition. And outside the window, spring continued its relentless arrival, bringing with it the promise of growth and renewal and the kind of beauty that comes after surviving winter's darkness. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a like, sharing it with friends, and writing a comment below. Your support means everything to us and keeps us inspired to tell more stories filled with love, resilience, redemption, and second chances. At the end of this video, you'll find another unforgettable romance from our collection. Click and discover where the next story will take you. With all our appreciation, the Empire of Heart Stories team.